When you think of Cupid, you might have a few different pictures in your head and not even realize it. In one, you might imagine the mythological winged god of love, beautiful, golden, and impossibly muscled beneath that tiny toga. In another, he might literally be a baby, a sweet red cheeked cherub sleeping wistfully on a cloud. Both of these visions of Cupid are historically accurate, but how did such different interpretations come to be? The transformation in imagery relating to the god of love may actually give us a glimpse into the changing social structures in ancient Greece and Rome, and even into the human condition itself. We seemingly can't stop yearning for love, even when we fear the pain that nearly always comes with it. Cupid was the god of love in its many forms in Roman mythology. In the even more ancient Greek tradition, his name was Eros, the Greek word for desire, and he ruled over both passion and fertility. Cupid was an incredibly powerful god, as well as a troublemaker, at times even harsh, capricious, and thoughtless. Without care to the consequence, he could inspire fires of longing that consumed gods and mortals alike until there was nothing left of them. He even used love as a form of punishment. A broken heart was his most fatal wound. Richard Martin, a classics professor at Stanford University, explains, in the Greek literary sources we have, he's depicted as just unconquerable, so whatever he wants to happen, happens, and he causes disaster. But despite all of this, Cupid was cherished at the altars of his temples as much as he was feared. Because even if mortals knew a shot from Cupid's arrow would hurt, even if it would make them crazy, they couldn't stop wanting to fall deeply, madly in love. And that is perhaps because, as the ancient Greeks seemed to realize, love is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. In Cupid's earliest iteration, dating back to 700 BCE, he was depicted as being a prime evil god, one of the first forces of creation and order in the cosmos. As told in Hesiod's Theogony, Eros was the son of Chaos, who was the original state of emptiness of the universe. In fact, Eros came into being at the same time as Gaia, the earth, and Tartarus, the underworld, which could speak to how the ancient Greeks imagined the significance of love and desire in relation to the human experience. Moreover, this incarnation of Eros was not just a god of sensual love. He was also the great power that holds the world together, symbolizing the harmony that connects separate natural elements and gives shape to the universe. Later, Greek mythology repositioned Eros as the son of Aphrodite. His paternal line was up to interpretation. By some accounts, he had no father, belonging solely to Aphrodite as her ever-present companion, creating mischief on her behalf. Other tales credit Eros' father to be Ares, god of war, Mars in the Roman tradition, Hermes, divine messenger of the gods, also known as Mercury, and even Zeus, the king of the gods, also known as Jupiter in the Roman tradition. In some legends, Eros had a brother named Anteros, the god specifically of requited love, and as anyone who has been rejected knows, reciprocated affection is a very different sensation. Thus, the brothers were often pitted against each other as opponents. Cupid's physical depictions also transformed over time. In the Archaic period, 650 BCE to 480 BCE, Eros was imagined to be an irresistibly handsome and roguish young man, at least in his late teens. Some of his most striking features were his beautiful golden wings and his intimidating bow and arrow, both gifted to him by Zeus. Sometimes Eros was portrayed wearing armor, hearkening to one of his other alleged fathers, Mars, aka Ares, who was always dressed ready for battle. Because of this, Eros has been used to symbolize the ironic parallels between love and war, or even the invincible strength of love. With time, Cupid, aka Eros, became younger and younger, transitioning his image from a highly sexualized young man to essentially a chubby baby. Portrayals in Alexandrian poetry from 323 BCE to 146 BCE show Eros as a mischievous child. By the end of the Hellenistic period, from 323 BCE to 31 BCE, he was even depicted as an infant. Some have theorized that the drastic change in these depictions can also be linked to a rise in misogyny and deepening patriarchal social structures in the 4th century BCE. And women in Athens, the cultural center for Greek literature and philosophy, were said to have it even worse than women in other Grecian city-states. One scholar described the living conditions for Athenian women in this era, saying, "Women were emerging from a state hardly above slavery." Because throughout much of Greek mythology, Eros acts on the whims of his mother, it seemingly became threatening to Athenian men for a powerful male god to be controlled by a female one. Moreover, scholars posit that there is something extra frightening to Athenian society about a male god who could create and destroy using love. Mortal men seemed to have less fear with a weaker-willed female in charge, and Eros was less intimidating as a beautiful child. Stanford Classics professor Richard Martin explains, "The way to sort of constrain, constrict, and diffuse Eros is to keep infantilizing him. He's under control, only the son of Aphrodite." By 27 BCE, Roman-era depictions of Eros, now called Cupid, continued to be cherubic as the youngest of the gods. In this period in Rome, classical thought was still seen as culturally sophisticated, so the Roman ruling class more or less adopted the Greek pantheon to blend together with other local religions to create their own, very similar deities. Later, Greek writing would even see multiple erotes, a pluralized form of the god. Similarly, in Latin poetry, there were multiple cupids that sometimes were referred to as amor. One of the oldest and most important centers to worship Eros was located at Thespiae in Boeotia. This city was the site of Eros's festival, called Erotia or Erotidia. Celebrated every 5 years well into the Roman Empire, scholars suppose the festival likely included orgies of drinking, dancing, and more disastrous amusements appropriate to a god who presided over fertility in man and nature. It also consisted of musical and gymnastic contests. Eros was a personification of devotion between men, even in friendship, so these exhibitions of athleticism and strength celebrated the kind of love and honor men shared as they weathered heroic adventures together. It is for this same reason that people from Sparta and Crete often made sacrifices to Eros before battle. But the ancient Greeks and Romans were not shy about celebrating sexual love between men. Some scholars have posited that Eros ultimately became a deity associated with homosexual love as well. While the exact origins of Erotidia are unknown, some legends attribute the festival to an infamous Thespian citizen who had gravely angered Eros, and say that the city founded the celebration as atonement on his behalf. It so happens the offender's name was Narcissus, and perhaps his story is a perfect testament as to why the ancient Greeks regarded this god of love with such fear and reverence. In the city of Thespiae, there lived the most beautiful mortal man Greece had ever known. Narcissus was so lovely to look upon, everyone who saw him fell in love with him. But Narcissus had no interest in any of his suitors, which consisted of humans and immortals alike. In fact, he rejected them all without even the slightest bit of pity. But even then, some remained devoted to him, even at the cost of their own lives. In some tellings of this myth, they speak of a man named Ammonia who came to Narcissus's door to beg for his love, and instead Narcissus sent down a sword. Ammonia took up his challenge, falling upon the sword that had been placed in his hand, and with his dying breath he called upon Eros to avenge him. Even had it not been for this fatal trespass, Eros was already inclined to punish Narcissus for his insolence. He had taken the beauty that was a gift from the gods and used it to disdain and revile love. He even had the audacity to believe himself to be immune to Cupid's swift arrows. And this is where the lovely and lonely nymph Echo comes in. In an incident that occurred long before this one, Hera, the jealous queen of the gods, had taken away Echo's voice in a fit of rage. Zeus had never been known for his ability to be faithful, and because Hera could never truly punish him, she often sought revenge on the women who had made her feel slighted by his numerous infidelities. With Hera's curse upon her, Echo could only mirror back the words spoken to her. And now, because of this long-suffered affliction, she would again become a pawn in a game played by the gods, fated to endure an even more miserable fate at their whims. Eros took 2 arrows from his quiver and pointed the first at Echo. as she was about to cross paths with Narcissus, who was traveling through the woods on a hunt. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, he describes Narcissus's cruelty at their meeting. "Keep your hands off," he cried, "and don't touch me. I would die before I would give you a chance at me." "I'd give you a chance at me," is all that poor Echo could reply. After their encounter, Narcissus came upon a serene pool of water. In some versions of the myth, Narcissus even was lured to the pool by following the sound of his own voice, a voice so beautiful it intrigued him, a voice that belonged to Echo, merely parroting his own words back to him. Exhausted by the heat of the day, he lay down near the water's glass-like surface, and in this moment Cupid set up his second arrow to fly straight into Narcissus's beautiful but cold heart. Narcissus was instantly in love, deep, passionate love, with his own reflection. He reached into the pool to try to hold his love. He put his lips to the surface to try to kiss his love. The second their lips met, his shy love would disappear, falling away in ripples every time Narcissus touched him. Echo continued to look on. She too had felt Cupid's arrow and could not let go of Narcissus, even after his rejection. She watched as Narcissus resigned himself to death, because he could never truly be with the one he loved, himself. In some versions of the story, Narcissus takes his own life at the banks of the pool, just as Amania had done at his doorstep not long before. Some say he finally felt remorse for the pain he caused others, disdaining their love and mocking Eros in the process. In other versions of the story, Narcissus never really learns. He merely wastes away slowly, staring at his own reflection until there is nothing left of him. However, in all of the legends, what is left of Narcissus, after he expired on the calm banks at the edge of the water, is no longer the body of a man, but that of a beautiful white flower. Echo, too, wasted away, unable to ever know love's sweet satisfaction. Some say she found a cave in the mountains to hide in until there was nothing left but her voice, and if you seek her out from these wild haunts, she can still call back to you, her lonely voice ringing and fading into eternity. But what was the tragic nymph's crime to endure such suffering by Cupid's arrow? Sometimes love was just cruel, like all of the other forces of nature, the sea and wind, the harvest, a flash of lightning, and death. Love doesn't need a reason to take from humans, even as it gives beauty, passion, energy, and life. The Greeks knew they existed at the whims and mercy of the gods. Other immortals were certainly not safe, and neither were they. Love was a gift, and the hope of finding it kept temples and altars devoted to love filled to the brim, such as at the Acropolis in Athens, with its well-known sanctuary on the north wall devoted purely to Aphrodite and Eros. But in capricious hands, love is also a curse. In fact, it is a terror. And perhaps for this reason, the same fearless warriors who battled in the Trojan War and braved 1,000 more epic adventures had to make love a little less scary. So if falling in love ever made you feel like a big baby, I guess you are not the only one.
Despite its notoriety for horrifying acts of torture and imprisonment, many of the tales about the happenings within the walls of the Tower of London have been greatly exaggerated over the years by those fascinated by dark and grim tales. However, the fortress's 1,000-year history still provides us with some events that are sinister enough to give credibility to the tower's reputation. This is the haunting history of the Tower of London. The beginning of what would become the infamous Tower of London was established by William the Conqueror shortly after his coronation on December 25, 1066. The first Norman king of England, now King William I, set out to build castles in the Norman tradition throughout the land not only to maintain control, but to serve as a symbol of power and dominance over his newly acquired subjects. The edge of the Thames River was selected as the location for one of the most important castles in English history. While the original structure was made of wood, work began around 1078 on a more permanent stone structure which would eventually become the central keep, known as the White Tower. It would take decades to build, and the resulting structure was a beast. Stone had been brought over from Normandy to build the impressive fortress, which rose 90 feet in the air and had walls 15 feet thick at their base. Over the years, monarchs would continue to expand the fortress, eventually adding lavish royal accommodations, a mint, an armory, a menagerie, and a jewel house where the crown jewels are still held to this day. However, the reputation the tower has today is largely due to the dark fate that many people were said to face once they entered the formidable structure as prisoners. But an exception to this destiny can be seen with the tower's very first prisoner. Since 1083, Ranulph Flambard had served under both King William I and his son, King William II. Under the elder, he served as Keeper of the Seal, and under the younger, he rose as high as Chief Minister, and even acted as regent in the king's absence. However, when William II died in battle, his younger brother Henry I took the throne and imprisoned Ranulph as a scapegoat for his brother's unpopularity. He became the tower's first prisoner on August 15, 1100. Ranulph spent 6 months in the White Tower before devising the tower's first escape plan. Ranulph, as well as many of the people of wealth and status who would follow him, retained great privileges while imprisoned at the tower. He had enough means and freedom to throw the tower guards a banquet in early 1101. Any successful medieval banquet requires barrels of wine, so Ranulph ordered several for the special event. Hidden in one of the barrels was a rope Ranulph had smuggled in. As the guards made merry and drank their bottomless wine, Ranulph used the rope to escape out of a window, met a boat he had arranged to wait for him, and made his way to Normandy. While Ranulph successfully became both the tower's first prisoner and first escapee, many more people, from commoners to royals, would enter its thick walls over the next 800 years, and some were not so lucky. The Tower of London has a reputation for torture and imprisonment that stems from the Tudor period in the 16th and 17th century. During this time, physical torture methods such as the rack or manacles were used. However, there are records of just 48 people being subjected to such horrific treatment. Indubitably, many others endured immense psychological torture while imprisoned. But it is the grim executions that took place at the tower, especially those of notable people, that seem to capture the most attention. Some of the most famous executions were those of not one, not two, but 3 queens who were all beheaded on the Tower Green. The first of which was Anne Boleyn, second wife to King Henry VIII. Anne's time as queen both began and came to a swift end at the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn was the granddaughter of one of the most powerful men in England, and spent many of her adolescent years in the French court. In 1522, she returned to England and became a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. Anne began to draw attention from many admirers in the English court, including Henry VIII, who was known to have mistresses, including Anne's own sister. Henry had become increasingly unhappy with his first wife, Catherine, who, despite giving birth to 6 children, produced no surviving sons. Ever desperate to secure a male heir and now infatuated by Anne, Henry made a case to the Pope in 1527 stating that because Catherine was his brother's widow when he married her, their union was a sin and should be annulled. The Pope would not answer him for many years, but ultimately refused the king's request. Not happy with this decision, Henry took matters into his own hands. In January 1533, Henry and Anne married. Henry's marriage to Catherine hadn't officially ended, so he was technically married to both women for a few months. In preparation for Anne's coronation in June, Henry made sure the royal apartment at the Tower of London was fit for his new queen for her customary stay before the event. The coronation was quite the lavish ordeal. Anne soon gave birth to a child, but much to the disappointment of Henry, it was a daughter, Elizabeth I. Just 3 short years later, Anne would return to the Tower of London and would stay in the very same accommodations. However, this time she came by boat through the notorious Traitor's Gate on charges of adultery involving several men, including her own brother, and plotting to kill the king. The charges had been brought about by Thomas Cromwell in an attempt to get rid of Anne, who had become unpopular at court and rendered useless when she could not produce an heir. Many historians believe these charges were either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Nevertheless, Anne stood trial and was unanimously found guilty. Just over 2 weeks after she entered the tower through the Traitor's Gate, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on top of Tower Green by sword instead of axe, a request from Anne that the king obliged. Anne's death didn't seem to impact Henry much, as he married his third wife, Jane Seymour, 11 days later. The next queen to meet a quite similar fate was actually Anne's cousin, Catherine Howard. She became Henry's fifth wife. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died after giving birth to the male heir he so desired, and his fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves ended in divorce. It's said that Henry fell madly in love with the young Catherine, and he was keen to secure the heir and the spare by having another son. The two married in 1540, just weeks after the end of his last marriage, but this one too would also be short-lived. It's believed, though not proved, that less than 2 years into her marriage to Henry, Catherine rekindled things with the former lover, Thomas Culpeper. Henry then learned of Catherine's alleged premarital affairs with not only Culpeper, but with 2 other men. The king was irate that his new young bride was unchaste when they wed. Catherine was taken to the Tower of London, possibly passing the heads of her alleged former lovers on stakes along the London Bridge. The next day, Parliament passed a bill which made it treasonous for a woman who was not a virgin to marry the king. 2 days after that, Catherine was beheaded in the same spot her cousin Anne was 6 years earlier. Then came perhaps the saddest of the 3 queens, young Lady Jane Grey. Known as the 9-Day Queen, Jane's journey to the throne was carved out by exploitive, power-hungry men in her life. She was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. As a child, Jane was sent to live with Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife who actually survived him. After Catherine's death, her then-husband Lord Thomas Seymour became responsible for Jane and arranged for her to marry her cousin King Edward VI, Henry VIII's son and successor, and Seymour's nephew. However, this road to queendom came to a swift end when Seymour was beheaded for treason before the marriage could happen. Jane returned to the care of her father and began spending time at the royal court. It was there that she'd meet the king's regent, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who would then become her father-in-law when her father married her off to the Duke's son. The Duke of Northumberland held great power as regent to teenage King Edward VI, who was stricken with a fatal case of tuberculosis. The Duke was able to convince the devoutly Protestant Edward to change the line of succession from his Catholic half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth to his Protestant cousin Jane and her male heirs. It's said that Jane fainted when she was first told the possibility of her becoming queen. Jane was proclaimed Queen of England just 4 days after Edward VI's death. At just 15 years old, Jane ruled for 9 short days before Queen Mary I, aka Bloody Mary, gained the throne when Jane relinquished it. Both Henry VIII's will and a previous act from Parliament proclaimed Mary the proper heir, and much of the public also supported her in taking the throne. Upon her dethroning, Jane was thrown in the Tower of London with her husband and father. Her father, ever the opportunist, even declared his support for Mary in an attempt to save himself, and he was pardoned shortly thereafter. Jane and her husband were charged with high treason, to which Jane pled guilty. She was sentenced to death, which was later suspended. However, her father got involved with the rebellion, and she was soon beheaded with her husband, and her father was not long after then. But perhaps the most tragic of the royal tales in the Tower of London is that of the 2 princes that would disappear from the tower under mysterious circumstances in 1483. In April of that year, King Edward IV died unexpectedly, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son Edward. The new King Edward V was placed under the protection of his father's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Edward's mother did not want the Duke to serve as her son's protector, and instead desired a regency council as she was aware of the Duke's great dislike for her and her supporters. But the young king's uncle was nonetheless instituted as Lord Protector as it was spelled out in his father's will. On his journey from home at Ludlow Castle to London, the young king was met by the Duke of Gloucester and escorted to the Tower of London, which was both a royal residence and a prison at the time. The now Queen Mother and the king's younger siblings took up refuge in Westminster Abbey, However, the Duke procured the king's younger brother, the Duke of York, who was also named Richard, from the abbey under the pretense that he was joining the king at the Tower of London in preparation for the coronation. The two would never leave the Tower alive. As Lord Protector, the Duke was effectively head of government and swiftly cleared a path for himself to the throne. The Duke alleged that the king and his brother had no claim to the throne, as their father, King Edward IV, had been contracted to marry another woman, making his marriage to their mother invalid and their birth illegitimate. His campaign worked, and in July 1483, the Duke of Gloucester was proclaimed King Richard III, just months after Edward's accession. What allegedly happened next is famously detailed in Sir Thomas More's History of Richard III. In it, he claims that two men were sent into the young boy's chamber in what has now become known as the Bloody Tower. While they were sleeping, the men strangled them until they could no longer breathe, holding pillows over their mouths. The men put the boys' bodies out naked on the bed to be inspected and true death confirmed. They were then ordered to bury the boys at the stair foot, suitably deep in the ground, under a great heap of stones. In 1674, nearly 200 years later, alterations were being made to the tower, and skeletons of two children were discovered under the staircase in the White Tower. Many believed these skeletons belonged to the princes. The remains were moved to Westminster Abbey and placed in an urn in Henry VII's chapel by order of King Charles II. Written in Latin, the inscription on the urn states, "Here lie the relics of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, these brothers being confined in the Tower of London, and there stifled with pillows, were privately and meanly buried by the order of their perfidious uncle, Richard the Usurper." In 1933, the skeletons were exhumed again and examined. The examiners believed that the bodies belonged to boys approximately 12 and 10 years of age who had likely died in the summer of 1483, aligning with the boys' ages and the alleged timeline of their untimely demise. The remains were once again placed in the urn and resealed. In 2013, forensic tests were able to confirm that other remains which had been found belonged to Richard III. People began to wonder if forensic tests may also be used on the skeletons found in the tower to see if they do, in fact, belong to his nephews. But it appears that the Church of England, with the support from the Crown, have repeatedly refused to allow the testing. There is some debate to this day as to who was responsible for the murder of the two princes. While we'll likely never know the true villain, King Henry VII, amongst others, have been floated as possibilities. But Sir Thomas More, and famously Shakespeare, would have us believe that Richard III is to blame for the tragic end of his young nephews. Interestingly, after refusing to declare allegiance to the Act of Succession, More too would find himself in the Tower of London, charged with high treason, of which he was found guilty. He was executed on July 6, 1535. While these dark events occurred centuries ago, the legacy still lives on in the lore of the tower. And if you're lucky, you may just receive a royal visit while at the tower, as the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and the two princes are said to still haunt the grounds to this day. In 1679, during the reign of the infamous Sun King, King Louis XIV, there was an outbreak in France that was terrifying, widespread, and wholly justified. An outbreak of fear to meet a terrible, untimely death by poisoning at the hands of a loved one or enemy. Known dramatically by historians as the Affair of the Poisons, these murderous crimes had become fashionable amongst nobles, prosperous bourgeois, and even amongst the common people, leading to scandalous arrests, torture, and executions at all levels of French society. Poisoners acquired their illicit materials from the numerous and sometimes legendary female fortune-tellers living in France at the time. The Duc de Saint-Simon went as far as to describe the calamitous era, saying, "It seems that there are, at certain moments, crimes which become the fashion like clothes. Poisoning was a la mode at the time." But at the start of the outbreak, some might say that France had never shone brighter. Under the leadership of the Sun King, France had been established as a great power on the European continent. In his time ruling, He had bolstered revenues, transformed the military, and supported the arts, becoming a patron to writers like Voltaire, who wrote that under Louis XIV, human reason in general was perfected. His court was sophisticated and luxurious, promoting ideals of France's grandeur perhaps best illustrated by the palace at Versailles, which he made the permanent seat of government by 1678. But for many, the prestige surrounding them was just elegant smoke and a hall of mirrors. The French aristocracy were not only arrogant, they were often seen to be as wicked, superstitious, and deluded. The Brinvilliers murder case of 1676 is credited by some to have kick-started the affair of the poisons. In it, the Marquise de Brinvilliers was convicted of poisoning 3 members of her family after being influenced by her lover, Jean-Baptiste Godard de Sainte-Croix, a man who was said to be friendly with an Italian artist of the poison named Egidio Exili. Ultimately, the Marquise was executed by beheading, and an estimated crowd of 100,000 people were present to witness her execution. Some say that because of her gender and status, the case became especially sensationalized, as a female mass murderer was seen as peculiarly monstrous. The case also aroused fear and suspicion that people of similar social standing to the Marquise could be committing these crimes undetected. 2 years later, in the fall of 1678, authorities learned of a plot to poison King Louis XIV. A mysterious woman had slipped a letter to a Jesuit priest while in confession, claiming that she had found a letter about a conspiracy to poison a man so powerful they could not even mention his name. Despite the unreliable source, the warning was taken very seriously. In response, Nicolas de la Reynie, the first lieutenant general in the Parisian police force, headed up what would ultimately become a 3-year investigation into the city's magical underworld. It is said that La Reynie had a tireless work ethic and an insatiable thirst for information, and it was through his extensive network of spies and informants that he came across this poison plot. From there, what began as a simple investigation into the conspiracy against Louis XIV became a larger and more twisted scandal than anyone could have anticipated. By the winter of 1679, while looking into the poison plot, 2 Paris fortune-tellers were arrested after being suspected of selling poison to wealthy customers. These 2 women were poisoner and occultist Marie Bousse and a palm reader, Marie Vigarou. When the Bousses' apartment was searched, they found a lot of arsenic as well as ingredients common in love potions. Under questioning, the 2 women named many of their accomplices, quickly filling Paris's prisons with members of its criminal, magical underworld. Louis XIV ordered a special commission to find and punish offenders, leading to the seizure and questioning of many of Paris's supernatural figures and sorcerers. These characters had long established a sort of magical underground of Paris, where they had made their living reading the future, giving advice on love affairs, or using magic to communicate with spirits for their clients. However, it was suspected that some of them also supplemented their income by selling poison, also sometimes referred to as inheritance powders, made of ingredients like dried toads steeped in arsenic. Police seized lists of ingredients for magic charms and poisons, grimoire and other manuals, as well as signed receipts of purchase from clients. Those who were interrogated confirmed that they were not only providing services to wealthy middle-class women, often because they were angry with their husbands, but that they also had clients of high nobility. Louis XIV made a decree that no matter one's social rank, perpetrators would face the full force of the law, and in April 1679, 13 magistrates from the Parliament of Paris were hand-selected by the king to form a special tribunal to try the accused poisoners. The function of the special tribunal, called the Champ de l'Arsenal, or sometimes the Champ Ardent, fiery chamber, was to try those accused of involvement in evil spells and composing, distributing, and administering poison. Louis XIV also appointed 2 doctors and apothecaries to serve as experts to study physical evidence and medical reports. They began hearing their first cases by May 1679. The trials caused some chaos amongst the royal court, as several prominent members were arrested or questioned by the special tribunal. According to some sources, many of those interrogated amongst the nobility admitted to buying magic or charms for love or for luck. However, some of the more serious perpetrators called in included the Comtesse de Soissons, the Queen's mistress of the robes, who fled France to escape her charge of attempted murder, as well as the Maréchal de Luxembourg, one of France's most respected generals who was imprisoned in the Bastille before his trial for sorcery and poisoning. Louis XIV found himself in an even stickier situation when his mistress of nearly a decade, the Marquise de Montespan, was accused of being a long-time customer of the infamous mystic Lavoisin. Montespan was known as a great beauty, often dressed in finery even nicer than the queen's, and to boot, she had given the king 5 children. It was alleged that the Marquise had engaged in satanic rituals in order to win the king's love, and that she had bought poison with the intention of harming another woman who had become the king's lover, Mademoiselle de Fontage, as well as intentions to harm the king himself. For some time, Louis was torn over what to do. The inquiry was essentially put on hold while the king and the police chief found a way to continue prosecuting perpetrators without forever discrediting his mistress. Ultimately, Louis allowed the inquiry to continue, but he put an end to the public proceedings against his mistress, and the charges against her were never proven. La Reynie's investigation into the Marquise de Montespan concluded that she had not tried to poison the king, but he did affirm that she had used a variety of love potions and aphrodisiacs on the king, often by sprinkling them in his food. He also concluded that she had most certainly employed a number of magical rituals to try to defeat any rivals for the king's affection. Moreover, the scandal also uncovered other courtiers that had used potions and magic rituals in attempts to gain the upper hand over their political rivals or lovers. All eyes in Paris were pointed at these scandalous trials, but because of their secrecy, the majority of news available was spread by gossip and hearsay. However, when a trial led to a conviction and execution, the spectacle was made highly public, with crowds lining the streets to watch the confessions, which were often followed by a hanging in front of Notre Dame. One of the most infamous women to be put on trial was Lavoisin, an occultist who was ironically arrested on March 12, 1679, while leaving her parish church's Sunday Mass. Madame Catherine d'Avoisin was a palm reader, fortune teller, and poison maker. Better known as Lavoisin, she dressed the part of the mysterious and powerful witch, often wearing a green velvet robe, embroidered tunic, and all over that, a loose crimson cloak. She sold beauty products that could be infused with magical properties, such as lip balms made with herbs said to make a woman irresistible to any man she kissed, or creams and perfumes made with rooster's combs and menstrual blood, allegedly infusing them with aphrodisiac properties. She was also known to attract clientele of especially wealthy and elegant women who would conceal their identities with ornate fans as they made their way into her home, seeking mystical help to help maintain their love lives, or revenge when those relationships fell apart. Several of Lavoisin's most popular love potions included dried pigeon hearts crushed into a powder clients would sprinkle into their lover's food, as well as a powder called cantharis, made from an iridescent green beetle that, when eaten, was said to cause a person's blood vessels to swell, making it a sexual stimulant. However, too much cantharis could also be poisonous, causing fever, vertigo, and madness. And in explicit cases of revenge, arsenic was considered one of the easiest poisons. Colorless, odorless, and undetectable, this household item, when administered in small doses, caused symptoms similar to many common illnesses, making it hard to prove as a crime. One way of administering poison was by washing one's partner's clothes in arsenic-infused soap, causing blisters, vomiting, and eventually could be fatal. Because of the blisters, doctors would often rule the death to be caused by syphilis. But Lavoisin was said to have her own even more exotic poisons, preferring the toxins and venoms produced by toads, which she could combine with arsenic to be even more effective. After a long and distinguished career providing tinctures that could bring love or death, Lavoisin was burned at the stake on February 22, 1680. It is said that nearly all of Paris came to witness her execution. By the time Louis XIV dissolved the special tribunal on July 31, 1682, they had investigated over 400 accused souls. Ultimately, the special tribunal judges would issue 319 warrants of arrest and oversee as many as 210 sessions at the Arsenal in Paris, all of which resulted in 36 people being convicted of poisoning and sentenced to death. At the end of the trial, King Louis actually decriminalized witchcraft in France by royal edict, saying that anybody claiming to have mystical abilities was fraudulent. In essence, he forbade people from believing in magic. For the French masses, the decriminalization of witchcraft did not prove to be an effective method of ending their belief in it. There is evidence that sorceresses and magicians, still operating largely in a magical underworld, continued selling their potions and wares into the 20th century. Historians continue to lament that the truth of these crimes and criminals may have been lost to time, and what we do know are only biased dramatizations of those that survived. Many feared putting things in writing, so news often spread by word of mouth, and limited first-person accounts like letters from this period were notably tainted by private prejudices. Moreover, historians note that even trial records and transcripts are misleading because defendants often lied or incriminated others as a strategy to distract from their own case. And because torture was used extensively, the coerced testimony given is not considered wholly reliable. So, we may never know the truth about what really happened.
Throughout European history, especially in the earlier centuries, religion was a large part of society and the center of many individuals' lives. For many European nations in the Middle Ages, the Church, along with the Pope, acted as an authority on both spirituality and as a governing body over the land and its inhabitants. And for followers, they were an example of everything righteous and good. Some, however, questioned the authority of the Church and faced dire consequences. Looking back at Church leadership during this time, there are certainly some examples that show cause for objection. In reality, the Church had many of the same problems found in any large governing organization, and the papacy was rife with corruption. But there was one pope in particular that stands out as one of the most controversial, corrupt, and philanderous of the fiendish leaders who resided at the Vatican. Greetings, I'm Dominique de Bell, and today we'll be taking a look at the life of Rodrigo de Borja y Doms, or Rodrigo Borgia, as he would become known in Italy and recognized internationally as Pope Alexander VI, leader of the Catholic Church. Even today, characterizations of Borgia range from conniving to evil, and some even call him the Devil Pope. What sort of misdeeds earned him this title? Did his transgressions truly stand out among other religious leaders at the time? Was he simply playing his part, reflecting back to the public an organization that was equally corrupt as a whole? Rodrigo was born in 1431 into a family of nobles from Valencia, in modern-day Spain, who became influential and well-known in both the church and in the political arena of 15th and 16th century Rome. Rodrigo's uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, would precede him as Pope Calixtus III from 1455 to 1458, and put himself in charge of young Rodrigo's education, setting him up with paid positions within the church when he was still a teenager. This blatant nepotism wasn't without controversy, but it was common within the walls of the Vatican. It would be the first of many instances of the Borgia family's partisanship and self-interest as they rose in power. At the time his uncle became pope, Rodrigo had not yet chosen a career path, meaning he was able to pursue opportunities that may have been unavailable to him before his uncle's rise to power, or had he pursued a specific position from a younger age. He studied law at the University of Bologna for 1 year before his uncle made him a cardinal on February 22, 1456, at the age of 25. His official title was Cardinal Deacon of St. Nicola in Carcere. Once he found himself in this more prestigious position within the church, he quickly rose in the ranks and became the Vice-Chancellor of the Roman Catholic Church just a year later. This position gave him his first taste of the vast wealth that came with the higher-up positions within the Vatican, and it would only increase as he continued to acquire more power. On the night of August 10, 1492, Rodrigo received a 2/3 vote to become Pope Alexander VI. He ran on a platform of being an outsider, Spanish as opposed to French or Italian, which made up the demographic of most previous popes besides his uncle. The election of Rodrigo Borgia as pope was widely approved by Roman citizens, though some contested it. Many believed that he had bribed his way into the most powerful position in the church. A Roman chronicler named Stefano Infessura described a mule train full of silver, which was allegedly sent to Cardinal Ascanio Sforza in exchange for his vote. But historian Jennifer Mara da Silva pointed out that the previous line in Infessura's writing was a sarcastic remark about bestowing gifts on the College of Cardinals rather than the poor, and that the rumor was discredited with the understanding that it was likely just hyperbole. Once he ascended to power, Rodrigo lived like royalty as commander of the Catholic Church. The papal seat wasn't always located in Rome. In fact, it was located in France for a period of time until about 10 years before the birth of Rodrigo Borgia. Along with his relocation came a resurgence of power, which lasted over 100 years until the sack of Rome in 1527. The office of the Pope was often involved in worldly affairs, and there was even a papal army. Through art, literature, and architecture, each papal administration strove to bolster the prosperity of Rome and make it a central element of Christianity that depicted unity. But oftentimes, instead of continuing the projects of their predecessors, popes during this time would focus their attention on new projects that benefited them and held personal importance. During the period leading up to Rodrigo's time, popes often elevated themselves and their families, along with the city of Rome. Greed, corruption, and plotting, along with political and military ambitions, had tarnished the reputation of the papacy long before Rodrigo took power. So he was by no means entering into a role that had always practiced what it was meant to preach. In the early 16th century, we'd see the Protestant Reformation challenge the Catholic Church, believing that Christians should look more to God rather than rely on the Pope or priests for guidance in their lives. So why did Rodrigo Borgia and his family become the face of this infamy? In today's times, a pope with multiple romantic partners and children would be considered disgraceful and shocking. But Borgia was far from the first pope to stray from celibacy. Borgia would indeed follow this tradition of papal nepotism with his children, appointing his teenage son Cesare as cardinal and putting his daughter Lucrezia in charge at the Vatican when he traveled. Eventually, however, more scurrilous accusations would soon befall on Rodrigo and his growing family, along with one scandal in particular that left a lasting impression of debauchery on the Borgia name. Rodrigo was thought to have fathered 7 to 10 children and had several mistresses. The mothers of his first 3 known children, Pedro Luis, Isabella, and Girolama, are unknown. He had his next 4 children with a Roman noblewoman named Banozza Catani. These children were the most well-known, and they were later legitimized by Rodrigo. They included Cesare, Lucrezia, Geoffrey, who would go on to marry the granddaughter of the King of Naples, and Juan, the commander of the papal army and Rodrigo's proclaimed favorite son. Juan was murdered in 1497, and his death had a profound impact on Rodrigo, who didn't eat or sleep for days afterward. Curiously, Rodrigo passed a series of reforms after his death to limit simony and the use of concubines within the Vatican, which were things he himself was known to take advantage of. As Rodrigo aged, he began a relationship with another well-known mistress named Giulia Farnese, and was said to have fathered her daughter, Laura. Interestingly, Giulia's brother Alessandro Farnese would later go on to become Pope Paul III. Cesare and Lucrezia were the most infamous of Rodrigo's children. Cesare later resigned from his position as cardinal and took over Juan's position as army commander after his death. He went on to lead successful military campaigns, conquering several territories in Italy and cultivating his own philandering reputation. Lucrezia was viewed for many years as a predatory seductress, but many historians today see her more as a victim. They believe she was used as a pawn by her father and brother to gain even more political power. She was betrothed initially to Spanish nobility when she was still a child, but Rodrigo later sought an even more politically advantageous alliance and married her off to Giovanni Sforza of Milan when she was just 13. Rodrigo would later use his powers as Pope again to annul Lucrezia and Giovanni's marriage, just before her 18th birthday, when their political alliance soured. Giovanni fled Rome in fear for his life after the marriage was officially annulled based on non-consummation due to impotence, according to some sources. Lucrezia was remarried a year later, but her relationships would only get more complicated. Her next husband was the teenaged Alfonso of Aragon, who was an illegitimate son of the King of Naples. They would have a son together, named after Lucrezia's father, Rodrigo. Just a year after their son's birth, an assassin would attempt to kill Alfonso. He survived the initial assassination attempt, only to be strangled to death while recovering. This murder happened just after Cesare made a political alliance with King Louis XII of France. Just a year after her husband's death, Lucrezia was entered into another politically strategic marriage to another Alfonso, this time Alfonso d'Este, son of the Duke of Ferrara. Cesare planned this marriage to aid in his own political conquests, but luckily for Lucrezia, it was her final marriage. Lucrezia and her brother Cesare faced many rumors while in the public eye, along with their father. Some accused Lucrezia of being incestuous with her brother and her father, a rumor possibly started by her first ex-husband Giovanni Sforza. There was also an additional child who began appearing in public with Lucrezia in 1501. A papal decree announced that he was an illegitimate child of Cesare and an unknown woman. Strangely, a second decree would come later, stating that the now 3-year-old was actually Rodrigo's. Because of these papal decrees, and the fact that the child was seen with Lucrezia, some believed the boy was a child of incest between Lucrezia and either her brother or her father. He would later be named Giovanni Borgia, and his mother would remain unknown. However, the drama didn't end there for Lucrezia and Cesare, as they would be present, alongside their father, for one of the most scandalous events to take place inside the walls of the Vatican. Known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, this salacious gathering was detailed by papal diarist Johann Burchard. It took place on October 31st, 1501, and involved a party with over 50 sex workers. The banquet was arranged by Cesare and took place in his chambers in the Vatican. After a large dinner, the courtesans were brought in to entertain guests and dance with them. The diary notes that the courtesans were initially dressed, but eventually took their clothes off completely as the night went on. At one point, chestnuts were thrown about on the ground by the guests, and the sex workers were ordered to crawl on the floor to pick them up. The diary then implies that people began to have sex with the courtesans, as the entry ends on, "Finally prizes were announced for those who could perform the act most often with the courtesans." While there's no detail on whether the Borgias participated in this contest, Rodrigo, Cesare, and Lucrezia were all present at this banquet. Additionally, Burchard's diary is considered credible by historians, since it would have only contained factual information and wasn't influenced by rumors of the time. The Banquet of Chestnuts was one of the most obscene events that took place during Rodrigo's time as Pope, and no doubt shocking for the public, whether or not he was directly involved. Despite this outrageous event, there's still evidence to suggest that Rodrigo's misdeeds weren't as severe as his reputation would suggest. Much of the negativity surrounding the Borgias came from rumor more often than truth. According to Nicholas Davidson, a lecturer at Oxford University, it's quite possible he wasn't as bad as he was made out to be. If you take away those pieces of evidence from biased sources, you may not have that much left. Storytelling was a large part of politics and society in general during the late 1400s and early 1500s. State ambassadors relied on their storytelling skills to negotiate special relationships, relay their state's allegiance with a new leader of the church, detail their own state's position, and aid in its advancement within the papal court. They also relied on stories to discuss all that happened or was assumed to happen back to the leaders at home. Modern historians also note that certain extraordinary events, such as the Banquet of Chestnuts, are often focused on and popularized in history more so than the long periods of uneventful, normal days during Rodrigo's time as Pope. These events in his personal life, though a small and infrequent part of his overall time in power, remain what he is known for today. Rodrigo had many accomplishments as Pope Alexander VI before he passed away in 1503 at age 72. There were rumors that he and his son Cesare had been poisoned, but most historians believe that malaria was likely the culprit. After her father's death, Lucrezia would retreat to the Ferrara court to live a normal life outside of politics before passing away at just 39 years old. Cesare survived his bout of malaria, but was later killed in a skirmish during his time fighting in the military in 1507. While Rodrigo was notorious for his nepotism with Cesare and Lucrezia, some believe that his use of them had more to do with their actual abilities and contributions to the church, as opposed to a selfish advancement of his own family. Whether the Borgia family was truly as wrongful as their reputation implies is up for debate, but there's no question this family is one of the most infamous to ever get involved in the highest office of the Vatican. Joe LaBelle's story can be traced back to a real report from 1930 by a journalist named Emmett E. Kelleher in the town of Pa. The story has since been popularized and retold in several books, first with Frank Edwards' 1959 work Stranger Than Science, and more recently with John Robert Colombo's Ghost Stories of Canada in 2000. More disturbing details of LaBelle's supposed account are revealed by Kelleher's report. Allegedly, there had been about 25 men, women, and children in the community, but there were no signs of anyone anywhere in the village. But strangely, according to LaBelle's story, there were no signs of violence. Tents were still pitched with tools and other items of value inside. LaBelle also claimed that he found unfinished shirts with the sewing needles still stuck inside, food still hanging over a fire pit, and a rusted rifle under a parka. It was as if the members of the community had left quickly, expecting to return, but vanished instead. Eventually, LaBelle reportedly encountered 2 emaciated but still living husky dogs, before discovering the bodies of 7 others that had apparently starved to death. Then, as LaBelle continued to search the camp with the 2 dogs following him, his story took a darker turn. He allegedly encountered a cairn that marked a gravesite, which had been disturbed by something unknown. According to Kelleher's report, LaBelle noticed how the lines of stones encircling the cairn were undisturbed, and that it didn't seem as though the grave had been dug up by scavenging animals. He said that the stones had been pulled off of one side, and there was nothing inside the cairn at all. I have no way of telling when it had been opened, or what had been done with the body it once contained, and I couldn't figure out why it had been desecrated. LaBelle allegedly went on to conclude that although there was no sign of struggle, the air seemed deadly. After catching a couple fish and feeding them to the starving dogs, he left in a hurry and reported his findings to the Northwest Mounted Police, who searched the area but found no trace of the villagers. And that was the end of the story as reported by Kelleher. But besides the legend, did anything ever become of LaBelle's chilling story? Joe LaBelle and Emmett E. Kelleher were indeed real people, but after closer investigation, it was found that their story had a few holes in it. After Kelleher published the story in a newspaper called the Danville Bee, news of the supposed incident spread through the community, and the Northwest Mounted Police began receiving inquiries. However, after an investigation in January 1931, Sergeant J. Nelson filed an internal report that was later released to the public, stating that he could find no foundation for this story. During his investigation, he discovered that Joe LaBelle hadn't actually been trapping in the area long at all. According to Nelson, LaBelle had taken out his first trapping license that same season, meaning he wouldn't have been familiar with the Inuit village from previous visits, as he claimed in his story. After taking a closer look at the news story and investigating Kelleher, Sergeant Nelson found that the reporter's journalism wasn't as reputable as some had assumed. He concluded that Kelleher was more known for publishing colorful stories rather than factual reports. Besides this, it was found that one of the photos provided in the news story was actually from 1909, 22 years prior to the alleged incident. After these details came to light, most people forgot about the story until it was published in Stranger Than Science 30 years later. Through the years, the story of the vanished village has captivated the imagination of both the general public and other writers. Other authors later retold the story in essence, often changing the location or crucial details along the way. Pieces of the story can be found in works such as Whitley Strieber's Majestic, Dean Koontz's Phantoms, and Stephen King's Storm of the Century. King's work also draws inspiration from another story of a disappeared community, one that was famously true. The missing colonists of Roanoke Island are likely the most well-known real-life example of an entire community disappearing. English settlers arrived on the island in 1587. By 1590, they were all gone and left almost no clues as to what happened. There were approximately 112 to 121 English settlers on Roanoke Island, which is now a part of North Carolina. The fate of this community is still largely unknown today, but historians and researchers have come up with a few hypotheses. Some believe that a virus wiped out the community. Others posit that a huge storm, such as a hurricane, decimated the area and killed its inhabitants. The settlers only left two clues behind: the word Croatoan carved into a gatepost and crow etched into a tree. This suggests that the colonists were, at the very least, planning to migrate to Croatoan Island, which is modern-day Hatteras Island, just south of Roanoke. But there's no definite answer on whether they ever reached their destination. Additional theories involve the indigenous communities who had lived on and around Roanoke generations before the English arrived to colonize the island. One theory suggests that the settlers were completely killed off by indigenous tribes. Other researchers suspect, based on archaeological remains, that the colonists actually split up and merged with different indigenous communities after unsuccessfully living off the land by themselves. During the time that LaBelle's story was first published, Inuit communities in Canada, Alaska, and Greenland still lived independently and mostly separately from settler communities, coming into contact primarily by fur trade. Oftentimes, when colonists encounter indigenous communities, they regard them as exotic or mystical. It's possible that Joe LaBelle bought into these notions in his tale, as many settlers still thought of Inuit communities as mysterious in the early 1930s. In the story, LaBelle mentions an evil spirit called Tornrark, hinting that this entity could be responsible for the village's disappearance. But according to the Curious Fortean blog, Tornrark is likely a misnomer for Tornagarsa, one of the many names given to a bear god in Inuit folklore, who is actually seen more as a benevolent deity. While spirituality and mythology is a large part of Inuit communities, their impeccable resourcefulness is an aspect of culture that is sometimes overlooked. These nomadic communities are able to survive off of natural resources by fishing and hunting caribou and sea mammals like whales, walruses, and seals. Each part of the hunted animals were used efficiently for food, clothes, and tools. Inclusiveness, self-reliance, and collaboration were valuable traits, and everyone was expected to support each other in these communities. Fur trading with Europeans began back in the 18th century and lasted another 10 years or so after the legend of the vanished village was first published. By the 1940s, however, traders from settler communities seemed less willing to travel to Inuit regions, which were far away from most cities. Dwindling investment and attention to these communities eventually led to the end of trading, and the Canadian government began to forcibly settle Inuit communities, causing pressure for them to adapt Western lifestyles. After years of neo-colonialist policy, much of Canada's Inuit population live in small communities that are often impoverished. But in the late 1990s, after years of activism and negotiations, each Inuit region has successfully settled its constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights agreements, including titles to their own land in each of their 4 regional homelands. These regions include Inuvialuit, Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, and Nunavut, which became its own territory in 1999. They've also won back extended administrative powers to govern according to their own ways of life. In recent years, combat sports have grown exponentially in popularity. Looking at the boundless fame, fortune, and glory surrounding top martial artists, boxers, and fighters alike, it's easy to glamorize these sports and their athletes. This idealization often extends to the combat sports of the past, put forth by literature, television, and films, depicting glorified and honorable warriors beloved by ancient society as legendary heroes. In the case of ancient Rome, however, this romanticization wasn't a perfect reflection of reality for its famed gladiators. So what were the lives of these ancient fighter athletes really like? Contrary to what you may guess, a gladiator would wake up each morning not surrounded by the walls of a sophisticated palace, but enclosed in a dismal cell. The true lives of ancient Rome's gladiators were more complex and harrowing than the stories and myths born from their legacy. To better understand a gladiator's place in Roman society, it's important to examine the strict hierarchy of classes that ancient Romans abided by. Within this system, rulers and the elites close to them enjoyed luxury and respect, while other members of society struggled at the margins. Towards the bottom of this hierarchy, there were those classified as infamia. These stigmatized individuals included convicted criminals, sex workers, actors, and even gladiators and their trainers. Infamia were not given the basic rights that typical Roman citizens possessed. Most gladiators, like any other infamia, were considered disgraceful and untrustworthy by the rest of society, and the word gladiator was considered a particularly sharp insult. Becoming a gladiator was rarely a choice one could make freely in ancient Roman society. In fact, in some cases it was considered a punishment for slaves that were particularly disliked by their masters. Many gladiators began as enslaved men or prisoners of war sold away to a ludus, or gladiatorial school, where they were put through incredibly strict and harsh training rituals. These schools were not unlike prisons. Archaeologists discovered the ruins of one gladiatorial school outside of Vienna, Austria, that contained only one exit, which led to the arena. While the gladiators that attended this school may have had some freedom to come and go from the barracks, they slept in what were essentially jail cells each night. Even for the rare few who entered into the gladiatorial schools willingly, it was usually a choice made out of desperation. Former high-status men who had their reputations ruined or became publicly disgraced could try their hand as a gladiator, and some criminals could work off their sentence with combat. While the majority of gladiators lived and died in shame and essentially anonymous to society, a very select few found success and fame. While the elites of ancient Rome always regarded most gladiators as dishonorable, some gained celebrity status and were even seen as sex symbols. Because of this, there were a small handful of free men who willingly entered into gladiatorial school in hopes to achieve some level of stardom. These free men signed a contract rendering them property and took an oath to endure, to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. The few gladiators that did obtain notability made enough of an impact on history to influence pop culture, leading many to generalize their fame. In reality, the majority of gladiators lived their lives in hardship, forced to entertain the masses without much hope of attaining a life that was truly their own. As a noicus, or new gladiator, your morning would begin with waking up locked inside your 16 by 10-foot cell. Since you are new, you would probably be kept in chains for your entire day unless you are actively training. Despite the small space, you may have a roommate who will live and train alongside you. A trainer would come by to unlock your cell so you could begin your day with a meal. Archaeologists believe you would be fed a mainly vegetarian diet, and your meals were given special attention to optimize fitness and promote strength. Before your training would begin, your trainers would physically examine you to help decide which type of gladiator you would become. There were two main categories of gladiators and many subcategories, and one would be selected depending on your background and physique. The first category of fighter was the heavily armed gladiator. These fighters benefited from the protection of heavy metal armor during combat, but were also slowed down by its weight. One subcategory of heavily armed fighters were the Samnites, who were equipped with a plumed helmet, short sword, long shield, greaves, and visor. There were also the Thracians, who had helmets, greaves, a small round shield known as a buckler, and a scythe-like dagger. Thracians were often pitted against Myrmilonus, who were also outfitted with a full set of armor, sword, and shield. A subset of Myrmilonus gladiators were Secutoris, who were also heavily armored but featured a helmet in the shape of a fish that encased most of their heads, protecting them but limiting their vision. The second category of fighters consisted of lightly armored gladiators, who weren't as well protected but were fast and agile in the arena. They included the Retiari, who used only a net, trident, and shoulder guard. They often fought against the Secutoris by trying to entangle them in their nets. If you lacked military background, you would likely be made into a Retiari. Lacari gladiators used lassos to wrangle their opponents. There were also gladiators called the Bestiari that fought unarmed against wild animals, and Venatores, who hunted animals in the arena. Equites would ride horses around the arena and dismount during combat. And Esidari fought on war chariots. Once this decision was made, your rigorous and specialized gladiator training would begin. Most of your waking moments are spent in the central courtyard of the school, practicing drills and learning new skills under the guidance of your trainers, who are all former gladiators. To practice swings and jabs, you would wield a wooden weapon against a large pole in the courtyard repeatedly. Your armor and equipment would be made heavier than the standard weight to maximize your strength and stamina. You would train alongside other gladiators of the same style and always fight an opposing style. As a result, you likely formed a close camaraderie with your fellow heavily armed or lightly armed gladiators. Sometimes you were permitted to have women visitors in your barracks to keep up morale. If you were lucky, you may take a wife and start a family, but this wasn't the case for everyone. If you exhibited any fear or resisted entering the arena, you were threatened with a hot iron or whip. After winning your first bout, you would no longer be called a Noicus, and instead earned the title of Veteranus. You and your fellow gladiators would be continuously hired out of the school by event sponsors for your entire fighting career. Your trainers would charge the sponsors a fee for each fight, and you would get a cut of around 20%. If you survived long enough and became skillful enough, you may become a Secundus Palus, or even a Primus Palus, which were labels given to the two best fighters in a school. But more than likely, many of your matches will end in a draw, rather than victory or defeat. Curiously, gladiator battles began as part of a funeral ceremony for noblemen. Men would fight to the death so that the spirit of the nobleman would be accompanied by the fighters in the afterlife. Soon, gladiatorial combat was put on in remembrance of the dead. As the events grew in scope and more money was invested, these bouts became more about public entertainment than a way to honor the deceased. They began to take place in amphitheater structures, such as the famed Roman Colosseum. Inside the amphitheaters, fighting took place in the arena, which derived the name from the blood-soaked sand that spread across the floor. Fights to the death became less common over time as money, resources, and years of effort were invested into gladiators. In fact, if a match did end in death, the trainers would charge the sponsor up to 100 times the original fee. However, if the gladiator was badly wounded or gave a poor performance, sponsors would be more likely to allow the killing of these unfortunate few, especially if the audience favored it. Sponsors who allowed killings were often seen as generous. Gladiator fights were a grand spectacle and lavish occasion for the public, with bills posted a few days before the event around ancient Roman towns and cities, advertising the type of combat and which fighters would appear. Over time, the events became so expensive that Roman emperors would be the only ones who could afford to be sponsors. The event would commence with a parade of all the participants, adorned in armor and carrying their weapons. Following that, a prelude battle would commence. These were essentially warm-up fights in which wooden swords and javelins were used. Exotic animals like lions would be brought out for the audience to marvel at, and the bestiari and venatores would perform around this time. Sometimes female gladiators, known as gladiatrices, would perform, but this was seen as more of a novelty than a true contest of skill between women. However, the intermission that took place around lunchtime, typically before the main bouts, was what gave gladiator battles their bloody reputation. During this part of the event, criminals who were condemned to death were publicly executed in the arena. Taken straight from prison to the arena, criminals had no training and stood little to no chance of survival. Sometimes execution was at the jaws of one of the animals. Other times it was by crucifixion or during naval-style battles called naumachia. There were even instances where criminals would battle each other, one armed with a gladius or short sword, and the other unarmed, forced to run for his life. This massacre would conclude with two men dressed as Mercury, god of thieves and tricksters amongst other things, and Charon, the ferryman of the dead, entering the blood-soaked arena. They would go around and stick a hot poker into each corpse or bash them with a hammer to ensure that each criminal was indeed dead. This all took place as spectators would get up to use the restrooms or purchase food or drinks from the many surrounding bars. Finally, with the sound of a trumpet, the main gladiatorial fights would begin. Music would continue to play through each battle, swelling in volume as the action crescendoed. What happened if a gladiator survived through his peak years of fighting and entertainment? It's not known how long a gladiator would fight throughout their lives, but retirement or a chance at freedom most likely came after his best years were behind him. In more rare cases, a gladiator would be granted his freedom by an emperor or sponsor if they displayed what is called virtus. Virtus was a specific virtue in ancient Rome that encompassed exceptional valor, courage, character, and masculinity. These lucky gladiators were awarded a symbolic wooden training weapon called a rudis, along with one last title, rudiarius. A rudiarius could not become a Roman citizen or possess any of the rights that came with citizenship, but his children could. Many rudiari would go on to become trainers and earn a living through charging event fees to sponsors and teaching the next generation of gladiators. Others would opt to continue to fight and earn money if their health allowed it, and they would often have bargaining power to negotiate more prize money. One famous gladiator called Flamma achieved rudiarius status 4 different times, but chose to keep returning to the arena. At the Colosseum's inaugural games, gladiators Priscus and Verus fought so honorably and for so long, the fight was declared a joint victory. Emperor Titus provided them with lavish gifts and honorably discharged them from service. These famous gladiators were particularly successful, and their good fortune was not the typical gladiator experience for many. Perhaps the most famous gladiator in history is Spartacus, who was the subject of countless stories and legends throughout the ages. His depiction by Kirk Douglas in Stanley Kubrick's 1960 film of the same name made a lasting impact on modern perceptions of gladiators. Spartacus became renowned not for his fighting prowess in the arena, but his leadership as a rebel fighter, desperate to escape his life as a gladiator. He came from a particularly harsh gladiatorial school that confined its pupils throughout most of the day. Spartacus was brought to the school as a former Roman soldier who was captured and enslaved after deserting the army. After facing immense isolation and torment at the school, he helped lead a revolt of 78 gladiators, armed with stolen kitchen knives. They were able to overpower the guards and found gladiatorial weapons to fight off the legionnaires sent after them. Spartacus led his group up Mount Vesuvius with the legionnaires close behind, who believed they had them trapped since there was only one path up the mountain. However, Spartacus and the gladiators made makeshift ladders, secretly climbing their way down to the legionnaires' camp, where they launched a surprise attack. Soon Spartacus and his gladiator rebel army were joined by thousands of revolting slaves in a campaign known as the Third Servile War, before he was eventually killed in battle. The true story of Spartacus sheds light on the plight of countless enslaved gladiators within the Roman Empire, whose tragic and brutal lives were quickly forgotten by spectators and lost to history. There are many fascinating and wholesome ways that winter holidays are celebrated around the world. Storytelling is a large part of these celebrations, and out of these stories, many of these comforting characters have become familiar symbols during this special time of year. Looking back through history, however, many of these mythological Yuletide figures are more dynamic, compelling, and sometimes darker than their polished and often Christianized counterparts. Krampus is just one of these sinister Yule characters that has become more popular in the United States in recent years. But there are many other monstrous entities found throughout other Germanic cultures. For example, rather than worrying about getting coal in their stockings, the children of Iceland watch out for a ghoulish giant feline with glowing eyes and a taste for humans, peeking at them through their windows around Christmas time. The Yule cat, also known as Jólakötturinn, is described as being enormous, even larger than local dwellings. Jólakötturinn was said to be similar in appearance to the real-life Norwegian forest cat, except for its size, with sharp whiskers and long, fluffy hair. The modernized story of the Yule cat was born from a poem in a book published in 1932 called Christmas is Coming. Some of the poem's translations paint a chilling picture of this murderous feline. He roamed at large, hungry and evil, in the freezing Yule snow. In every home, people shuddered at his name. If one heard a pitiful meow, something evil would happen soon. Everybody knew he hunted men, but didn't care for mice. The poem stems from older Icelandic mythology dating back centuries. It warns that those who haven't received new clothes by Christmas, particularly children, are at risk of being attacked and eaten by the Yule cat. The cat is said to stalk and target children with torn, tattered, or frayed clothing before carrying them off to be devoured. The idea of a giant rapacious cat is not unheard of in Icelandic culture, and the Yule cat is not the only threat of its kind. In an episode of PBS's Monstrum, Dr. Emily Zarka notes that Iceland has other dangerous mythic felines as well. There is the legend of the ghoul cat, or wasteland cat, which has the ability to bury itself underground and grow larger in size. It then resurfaces to hunt and attack unsuspecting birds, sheep, and humans. The legend even says that the cat's stare alone can be enough to kill a person. Additionally, two giant flying cats are said to pull a wagon across the sky, carrying Freya, the goddess of love and sorcery. As interesting and terrifying as this Yuletide monster is by itself, there's more to the story surrounding the Yule cat. The giant feline is actually a pet to a horrifying family of trolls led by a matriarchal ogress named Grýla. Some of these mythological figures date back to the 13th century and vary in tone from benevolent, gift-giving pranksters to dangerous creatures known for kidnapping and eating humans. Grýla herself began as a legend separate from the notion of Christmas time, originally symbolizing and personifying the doom and danger of the harsh winter weather and the dangerous, unforgiving landscapes of Iceland. These terrains include volcanoes, glaciers, and mountains, where she is said to reside with her troll children, known as the Yule lads. The legend states that the ogress, whose name translates to growler, at one point had a husband, but she ate him when she became bored of him. Her earliest descriptions depict her with 300 heads, 15 tails, a beard, and the ears and horns of a goat. Each year prior to Christmas, she travels down from the mountain with a sack to kidnap naughty children, while her troll sons, the Yule lads, reward well-behaved children with presents. The number of Yule lads varies according to different tellings of the folktale, but there are as few as 9 and as many as 22, with 13 being the most accepted number. Each Yule lad is responsible for bringing a gift to Icelandic children for each of the 13 days leading up to Christmas. They deliver gifts with the help of a second large mythological creature, the Yule goat, and each of the lads plays pranks associated with their names. For example, Spoonlicker visits on December 15th and is known for licking spoons. Door Slammer arrives on the 18th to slam doors, and Window Peeper looks through the windows of each house on the 21st. Small gifts are usually left in the children's shoes, such as chocolate or fruit. If a child misbehaves, the Yule lads might leave them a potato instead. If the child misbehaves further, they could risk being kidnapped and eaten by Grilla. On the 25th, after the Yule lads have finished delivering their gifts, the Yule Cat begins his hunt for children who didn't receive any new clothes. This legend bore an Icelandic tradition of giving socks before Christmas in order to keep loved ones safe from the claws of the Yule Cat. The Yule Cat and its frightening family scared Icelandic kids into obedience for centuries. In 1764, the stories caused enough of a ruckus among local children that using these stories as fear tactics and a means of discipline was banned outright by the government. As time went on, some of the edges around these characters softened, and the Yule lads underwent a sort of sanctification. They are now known to sport red clothes, white beards, and round bellies. However, the somewhat brutish nature of these earlier Yuletide figures reveals important values in Icelandic history and culture that were instrumental to a healthy society. As far back as the Middle Ages, Iceland's principal export was sheep's wool. Manufacturing wool clothing and products contributed majorly to the overall economy of the country and was essential to individual communities. The sale of wool not only helped keep families financially stable through the harsh winter months, it also ensured that families had enough wool to face the dangerously cold conditions themselves. Each member of the family was expected to contribute to the practice of harvesting the wool from sheep, processing it, and turning it into garments and other products. Children and domestic workers who helped their families sufficiently prepare and weave the wool during the autumn and early winter months would be gifted wool articles of clothing in exchange, such as socks. Those who didn't sufficiently help their families prepare for winter would not receive a garment. The reasoning behind the legend of the Yule Cat may have been to support a strong work ethic directed toward families' wool production leading up to the coldest parts of the winter months. It may have also served as a warning to those who didn't assist enough, with the threat of being eaten by the giant cat. In this sense, the symbolic danger of the Yule Cat likely represented the real risks associated with an unproductive season. Whether you prefer a haunting tale of child-eating ogres and giant cats, or a more wholesome story of friendly gift-giving trolls, it's important to heed the central message of these legends and do your part to support your friends, family, and community through whatever tough times may lay ahead this holiday season. March 25th, 1911 was a typical workday until 4:40 p.m. that afternoon. Located in what was known at the time as the Ash Building, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located on floors 8 through 10, with the lower floors dedicated to other factories and retail space. Owned by the Shirtwaist Kings, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, they focused on the production of the highly popular garment in the name itself, the shirtwaist. This was one of the first articles of women's clothing to become hugely popular among all social classes, due to it being both fashionable and more comfortable than many of the trends before it. In a factory like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the typical day often meant sharing close quarters with over 500 fellow workers. The vast majority of these workers were young girls and women between the ages of 14 and 20, many of them from Italian, German, and Irish immigrant families. For the usual 13-hour day, there was sometimes one half-hour break, if the schedule allowed. During the busier seasons, it often didn't. Efficiency reigned supreme during this time period, and many decisions were made that prioritized productivity above all else. For example, doors were locked during the day to prevent employees from stealing or spending too much time using the restroom. Pay was low. In comparison to the spending power of the dollar today, there are estimates that workers were making between $3.50 and $6.50 an hour. One woman who participated in strikes for better conditions discussed general standards of her workplace as unsanitary. That's the word that is generally used, but there ought to be a worse one used. There had been a push for change only 2 years earlier, beginning in 1909. Garment workers, a group primarily made up of working-class women, organized a massive strike, demanding a shorter 52-hour work week, a 20% pay raise, and increased pay for overtime, among other things. 20,000 workers from 500 factories walked out during a demonstration that was later known as the Uprising of 20,000. Small and medium-sized factories fell into agreement with the demands of the demonstrators during the earlier days and weeks of what would end up being 3 months of demonstrating. However, the larger factories held out. Harris and Blank of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory met with owners of the 20 largest factories to form an association against meeting these demands. According to some reports, the association made decisions that even included hiring people to physically attack strikers and forming alliances with police, who would then move to arrest strikers.
Uusi revitaalista laser anti-age-rutiini. 88% naisista vaihtaisi laser-rutiiniin.
By February 1910, the strike had ended. Some of the demands had been met, such as an increase in pay, while others were successfully prevented by the coalition of large factory owners, such as becoming a union-only, closed factory. The goal of this had been to increase the power of the factory workers, should they want to push for further change. A little over a year later, the workdays were carrying on again as usual. What changed March 25th from being an ordinary day to a full-blown tragedy happened in only a matter of minutes. The exact series of events can't be known for sure, but what likely started as a discarded cigarette or a match into a rag bin of highly flammable materials and fabrics became an uncontrollable flame that would rip through the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and several other floors in the Ash Building. Some reports claim there was an attempt to oust the initial flames before they grew out of control, but that the fire hose on site was rotted and rusted to the point of being unusable. This shortcoming would be one of many that would contribute to the 129 girls and women and the 17 men that lost their lives. A large portion of those that died on this day were girls aged 17 or younger. As the realization of imminent danger set in, workers began to panic and look for a means of escape. Some people rushed to the single elevator. During a previous inspection, the installation of a second elevator had been recommended, but it was never addressed. The elevator car could only hold a maximum of 12 people at a time. It broke down after 4 trips. With a lack of sprinkler system of any kind, there was nothing keeping the fire at bay. Others began running toward doors and stairwells, only to find them either locked, as was common practice during the workday, or unlocked, but only able to be opened inwardly. As hundreds of people piled against the doorways, there was no room to open the only unlocked doors against the building pressure of bodies. Those inside were running out of ways to escape. For many, using the fire escape outside was a solution, until it wasn't. People fled in droves, overloading a weak fire escape that soon collapsed due to a lack of sufficient support. Inspectors had previously also suggested the installation of an additional fire escape that went unmet. As firefighters finally arrived at the Ash Building, they began extending their ladders to try to rescue people from windows, only to discover that they stopped short at the sixth story of the building. Options for those located above, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory workers, were dwindling. They wouldn't have access to the ladders. The situation was quickly becoming life or death. Nellie Ventura, an 18-year-old girl, recounted her harrowing escape to a newspaper.
I ran at once to the window opening on the fire escape on the 9th floor and cried to the other girls to follow me. I don't know what happened then, but I stepped out on the ladder and looked down. All below me was thick smoke, with red tongues of flame showing through at the 8th floor. At first I was too frightened to try and run through the fire, for I thought I would be burned to death. When I heard the screams of the other girls and heard the roar of the fire in back of me, I knew I had to go down that ladder or die there.
Firefighters set up nets for people who had no choice but to leap. Horrifically, this too would be an option that would soon fail. The impact of the fall from the many people leaping from such great heights caused the netting to break. Many people chose to jump, some believing netting might catch them, others knowing they had no other means of escape. Of the 146 deaths accounted for that day, around 50 were the result of people who jumped from the windows onto the street below. Those who witnessed this recalled the experience of being helpless onlookers to the scene. Journalist William Gunn Shepard wrote,
I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture. The thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk.
Despite the heartbreaking number of lives lost, some people were able to escape. 150 of those survivors were rescued by the quick thinking of two law students, Charles E. Creamer and Elias Conter. Creamer and Conter were in the building next door when they learned of the fire. They climbed to the top of their building, which stood 1 story higher than the Ash Building. They found and fastened together 2 ladders and used them to create a path between the 2 roofs. This makeshift apparatus saved the lives of 150 people who were able to successfully climb over and up from the Ash Building to theirs. In less than 30 minutes, it was all over. Families, friends, and onlookers gathered around the area, despite police orders, to try to identify the faces of the dead. In the time that followed, the focus turned to investigating the tragedy, with many demanding changes to prevent such a thing from happening again. The fire chief in charge at the time lamented,
This is the greatest loss of life at any fire I have ever known. I have prophesied over and over again that just such a thing was bound to happen in some loft building or office building. They call them fireproof and so think no fire escapes are necessary, but they are not fireproof, only slow burning. Such safeguards save buildings, but not human life.
Mourning and outrage soon turned to organizing. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 5, 1911, a crowd of around 100,000 people participated in the funeral procession for the victims down Fifth Avenue. They followed the hearses to the ceremony, where thousands more met up to pay their respects at the memorial. Some accounts even suggest upwards of 350,000 people attended to pay respects to the victims. Unions were among some of the first to demand justice, including the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. 1 week after the fire, union leader Rose Schneiderman stated,
I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement.
And for those that did rally, they championed change. One woman named Frances Perkins actually witnessed the fire and saw young people jump to their deaths from where she was standing in Washington Square. Over the next 20 years, she took her prior experiences in social work, sociology, and economics to work to bring change at the executive level, and later declared that this was the day the New Deal was born. Perkins would end up being the first woman to ever serve in a president's cabinet as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. During her time in FDR's cabinet, She helped pass worker protections on a national level, including the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. These help to protect workers' rights to organize and practice collective bargaining in the private sector. They also set standards for minimum wage, overtime pay, limits to child labor, and countless other protections. In the meantime, changes were also happening on the ground. By the end of June 1911, the Factory Investigating Commission was formed. They held public hearings, toured factories, and interviewed workers, eventually leading to the creation of 30 different health and safety laws. These laws ended up serving as a catalyst for future labor laws in the United States and led to the investigation of nearly 2,000 factories from various industries. Some of the laws the Commission set into motion required better fire safety measures, including outwardly swinging exit doors, sprinklers, and overall higher standards for sanitation and ventilation. While others were fighting for the future, some may have been left wondering, what about this fire and these victims? The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were indicted and stood trial for multiple counts of manslaughter as a result of the fire. But by December 1911, they were acquitted. They continued to navigate civil lawsuits for the next few years, which resulted in payouts that averaged around $75 per victim. However, their insurance payout was much greater than the fines the men were ordered to pay. They received nearly $60,000, about $400 per life lost, and actually made a profit in the end. Some people pointed fingers at previous factory fires that had happened at other sites Harris and Blank owned. Supposedly, insurance scams in the garment industry were common at the time, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory had a notably inflated fire insurance policy. However, the court did not find significant evidence of fraud, nor of intentional wrongdoing on the part of Harris and Blank that may have led to their employees' deaths. There are plenty of other aspects to this story that remain unclear, as some of the numbers and details of that day are debated. Some claim that the fire lasted only 18 minutes, while other sources report it lasted 30. Some say there were 500 people working that day, while others claim 800. Even the identities of 6 of the 146 total victims were unknown for 100 years. Thankfully, that was one mystery from March 25, 1911, that was finally solved in the year 2011. Genealogist Michael Hirsch was able to identify the 6 individuals whose identities were not known due to the severity of the burns and damage to their bodies. Their names and profiles were finally able to be added to the official victims list. Josephine Camarada, age 17, Dora Evans, age 18, Max Florin, age 23, Maria Giuseppa Lauletti, age 33, Concetta Presti-Filippo, age 22, and Fanny Rosen, age 21. Since then, many changes have been implemented to the workplace to ensure safety. In 1911, it's estimated that up to 100 workers died on the job every day in the United States. In 2020, 4,764 workplace fatalities were reported to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics for the entire year, averaging to around 13 people a day. And while any loss of life derived just from meeting the demands of a job is tragic, we've come a long way in worker safety.